Hey everyone! When governments consider what policies to approve, they're often making decisions in part based on one big question. Will this make society better off? Well, when designing policies, we need to know what framework the policy decision maker uses to answer that question. Now, many such frameworks exist, but I wanted to start off today with one that is very common: utilitarianism. So, let's get right into it. If you're wondering where ethical frameworks fit into the world of public policy, well, it's the decision-making part of the policy cycle. Now, beyond just that's how decisions are made, it's also very important for the previous step, the policy formulation stage of the policy cycle. In order to effectively design policies for the decision maker, you need to understand their ethical framework. This is why it's important for anyone studying or practicing public policy to have a good understanding of political theory. As mentioned at the start, one such ethical framework is utilitarianism, which gained prominence in the 18th and 19th centuries in a time of rapid industrialization and social change. It provided a practical way to evaluate policies in an era of expanding democracies and greater concern for societal well-being. The word that you'll most often hear associated with utilitarianism is happiness. In fact, Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, formalized the theory as the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and he said that that is the measure of right and wrong. In other words, the ethicalness of an action is the amount of happiness that it creates. The more happiness that an action creates, the more morally right it is. Now, happiness itself is the difference between pleasure and pain. So something that produces a lot of pleasure and very little pain would produce a lot of happiness and therefore be morally right. Whereas something that doesn't create much pleasure but produces a lot of pain would be something that creates negative happiness or simply unhappiness, and that is something that would be morally wrong. Now, while utilitarians will use the word happiness, they will also use the synonym utility, and that's where the term utilitarianism comes from. Bentham also listed 7 variables that can help us determine the utility or happiness of a particular action. First, intensity. How strong is the pleasure or pain? Second, duration. How long will the pleasure or pain last? Third, certainty. How likely or unlikely is the pleasure or pain to occur? Fourth, the nearness. How soon will the pleasure or pain occur? Fifth, the fecundity. Will the action be followed by sensations of the same kind? In other words, will the pleasure or pain be repeated? Sixth, the purity. Will the action be followed by sensations of the opposite kind? In other words, will there be some sort of backlash? And finally, the extent. How many people will be affected by the pleasure and or pain? The total calculation of utility is the sum of the impact on every individual's utility. For example, imagine a policy considering building a new park. The pleasure would come from the people who get to use the park, while the pain would be the costs of construction as well as potential disruptions to nearby businesses. Bentham's theory helps us weigh these considerations. The next important figure in utilitarianism is John Stuart Mill, who actually called his book Utilitarianism. He refined Bentham's theory by adding the element of quality to the calculation of happiness. For him, there was a difference between higher pleasures and lower pleasures. Higher pleasures were things associated with the mind. So think of intellectual pursuits, moral satisfaction, and aesthetic appreciation. Meanwhile, lower pleasures were things associated with the body. So think of physical comfort. Now, as you can guess, for him, higher pleasures were more valuable than lower pleasures. In a modern sense, he would say that, binge watching your favorite show is a form of lower pleasure, whereas investing time to learn a new skill is a form of higher pleasure because the satisfaction that it provides is deeper and more long-lasting. In the public policy sense, he would say, investing in a public library is a higher pleasure, whereas investing in, say, a new sports venue is a form of lower pleasures. So it's not just about how much happiness is created, but also about the type of happiness. He also made the calculation of happiness much more individual. He recognized that different people could gain different amounts of pleasure or pain from the same thing. This made utilitarianism much more adaptable to complex situations. Now, of course, there are criticisms of utilitarianism. One of the major ones is the tyranny of the majority. That is, the happiness of the majority can be justified under utilitarianism even if there is significant pain amongst the minority. And that's because the happiness of two individuals can be offset by twice the unhappiness of another individual, and under utilitarianism, that would still be morally just. Thinking about that in the policy sense, there could be a policy that significantly damages the minority population so long as it is offset by sufficient enough gain of the majority population. Other criticisms center on the fact that some things are just very hard to quantify. So how do you judge the amount of happiness generated from, say, clean air or community bonds or someone's sense of purpose? These things are hard to quantify and so can make utilitarianism hard to practically apply. One of the major fields in which utilitarianism is used is economics, where it is the foundation of welfare economics, which evaluates economic systems based on the amount of welfare or happiness that it creates across society. In fact, many economists will simply state that their proposal is good because it maximizes welfare. And what they mean is it maximizes happiness under a utilitarian framework. And oftentimes they don't even realize that's what they're saying. This has even extended to the creation of a theoretical unit of happiness called a util. Now, measuring a util is not possible. And so what economists will often do is say that the amount of happiness or the number of utils that an action generates is equivalent to a dollar amount. So for instance, someone's willingness to pay for a good is the amount of utils that they receive from getting that good. Now, in my video explaining the basics of taxation, I discussed people's willingness to pay and how that correlated to consumer surplus. Thinking about this from a utilitarian standpoint, their willingness to pay would be how much they get in terms of happiness or utils from the good, and how much they actually pay is how much they have to give up in utils. So that's the pain of the interaction. And so the difference is the net happiness that is generated by them purchasing the goods. So consumer surplus is really just that net happiness that's generated from the market. Another instance where you'll hear money used to replace utils is in cost-benefit analyses. The cost of something, the pain, relative to the benefit, the pleasure of it, is often measured in terms of dollar values. However, as I mentioned before, that can be challenging when we think about non-tangible things like clean air, sense of purpose, an extra year of someone's life. These are hard to quantify, but in cost-benefit analyses, the utils of those things are translated into dollars. Some would argue successfully, some would argue not successfully. There are some weaknesses to using, dollars. Modern economists are trying to address some of these issues through greater application of things like behavioral economics and what they call happiness economics, by looking at more survey and qualitative data to supplement the hard quantitative data that they have more readily available. Ultimately, when it comes to public policy, many decision makers will use a utilitarian framework for making a decision, although they won't always use those exact words. Sometimes they will say things like, do the benefits outweigh the costs? Is there a positive welfare from this decision? Or even something like, does this contribute to the broader good? These sorts of questions can be asking for things from a utilitarian perspective. So what do you think? Do you think using a utilitarian framework is always the best way to come to decision? Or are there other factors that you think need to be considered? Let me know down in the comments. A few ways to think about this in action could be, does fixing a pothole yield more pleasure in the long term than the pain of the cost of raising taxes and closing the road temporarily to fix the pothole? Does prioritizing certain populations to get vaccines first generate higher overall happiness, despite the cost to other populations that don't get the vaccine? Or will this military intervention lead to more long-term happiness than the pain associated with the potential losses? These are the sorts of questions we would ask from a utilitarian framework. Knowing if your decision maker uses a utilitarian framework for decision making can help you formulate policies to maximize utility. Now, you may be wondering if this is the only ethical framework that people use to make decisions, and of course, no, it's not. But it is certainly one of the most popular, especially in the Western world. In future videos, I will look at other frameworks that can be used to make decisions. But for now, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.